Welcome to Defense News. I'm Vago Muradian. The National Commission on the Structure of the Air Force is recommending big changes in how the service is organized. One commissioner tells us how jobs should be shifted among the active, guard, and reserve forces. But first, an exclusive interview with Senator Tim Kaine. The first-term Democrat represents Virginia, where roughly 1 in every 8 people is either a uniformed service member or veteran. Virginia is also home to the Pentagon and numerous military installations, including the world's largest naval base in Norfolk. The former Virginia governor and former chair of the Democratic National Committee has been a strong supporter of President Obama. The administration submitted a $500 billion budget request 2 weeks ago that is both confusing and contradictory about a number of critical defense priorities, including the future of the Navy's 11th nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. I met with Senator Kaine at the Capitol earlier this week and asked him whether the administration had undermined the Pentagon's credibility on the Hill and what they have to do now to get their plan through.
Pentagon did confuse us. We noticed this right away. So they've created confusion, and they've got a little bit of missionary work to do to get it back. But compared to the confusion we put into their line of work by not giving them a budget for 4 years in a row, by doing shutdowns, by doing furloughs, by doing sequester, by not being able to give them budgetary certainty. If there's fault on any part of the operation, I would still say it's on Congress's shoulders. When I came into the Senate, no budget for 4 years. The DoD can't operate under that kind of uncertainty, especially with a complicated world. We got a 2-year budget in December. That's good. We got an appropriations bill in January. That's good. We got over the debt ceiling hurdle in February. That's good. But we got a long way to go, and it's mostly on Congress's shoulders to give them more certainty.
Do you think that there's any appetite up here? I mean, what effectively the administration is asking for is to break the deal effectively.
Yes.
Is there any appetite for repealing sequestration and giving them more money?
There is not an appetite to repeal it, to turn it off 100%, and that's not what DoD is asking. Basically, what they're saying is, you gave us some relief in 14 and 15, fine. Give us some relief in 16 through the end of the sequester period.
Sort of a half sequester.
Yeah, it really is. If we give them everything they've asked for over the course of sequester, they will still have absorbed more than 50% of the sequester cuts, but we will have given them relief to about the tune of about 50%. I think that's a fair ask. Now, when we saw what sequester do in 14 and 15, Congress is willing to make an adjustment. It is my hope, and we're going to definitely argue and pitch this, I have since I came in, that we ought to try to provide that relief in 16 and in future years. And the fact that they just asked for some relief rather than a repeal, that was smart. And we're going to have to battle for them now to see if we can make that happen.
What kind of odds would you give it?
You know, I would say I doubt you'll see anything anytime soon. I mean, we did a 2-year budget to give more certainty, but that also creates a challenge, which is we're not likely to go back and revisit FY15 anytime soon. They need to get a signal for FY16 and out, but technically we don't have to pass an FY16 budget for a while. So I'm not sure that we will give them that relief, you know, in the near term. But look, as you know, I've got Republican colleagues on armed services who feel very strongly that we need to give them sequester relief. Probably we feel it on armed services more than any committee, and it's more bipartisan on armed services than other committees. Right. So look, people didn't think we'd do it in 14 and 15, and we did some. My hope is that we will get close to what they asked.
Has defense spending bottomed out, as some suggest, or do you think there's more downside potential?
I think there's going to continue to be efforts to find more savings. You know, I think the issue for me is less whether it's sort of bottomed out in gross terms than, you know, the sequester is kind of the gross, well, we're just going to cut X. There's going to be more and more pressure to go line item by line item and program by program to determine whether we can find efficiencies and savings. With the $17 trillion debt, we have to continue to do that. By the same token, I think it is also incumbent upon us in Congress, if we're going to be doing that with a defense budget, we also ought to be doing it with the $1.2 trillion of tax expenditures, loopholes, deductions, credits that we hand out every year. We ought to be looking through those line items the same way we're looking through the defense budget.
Let me take it to Carrier. Your state is home to the largest naval base in the world. The Navy wanted to get rid of one of the 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Not refueling the George Washington. They're now hedging their bets. Pending more money, they will do the refueling overhaul. But the White House told them, hey, look, we want you to keep that ship, and now we're in this period where we're trying to find the money for it. Is that a political game, or do you actually expect that ship to come back in service at some point?
I expect it to come back in service for this reason. There is a statutory requirement for an 11-carrier Navy. There's a lot of things that is in the DoD budget now that's not statutorily required. I would have a hard time seeing Congress right now signing off on an administrative request to change the statute from an 11-carrier Navy back to a 10-carrier Navy. I know Congressman Forbes over on the House side plays a key role in that Armed Services Committee.
His constituency.
And he's been pretty blunt about it, and I look at my colleagues around the table. I don't see Congress getting on board, both houses of Congress getting on board with a change in the statute from 11 to 10. And so what it would ultimately mean if we don't get on board is that even at sequester level, the White House statutorily has got to fund the 11 carriers, even if they take it out of other program line item hide. Now, my hope is it's these kinds of pressures and choices that make us do in 16 and thereafter what we did in 14 and 15, which is provide some meaningful sequester relief.
There are those, however, who look at the aircraft carrier and say, look, the Navy hasn't invested and has been very reluctant to invest in long-range stealthy aircraft to put on that deck to increase the striking range of the carrier, and also in war that the Navy becomes very reluctant to use the carriers for fear of losing the carriers, especially in certain scenarios. And so the ship becomes an expensive liability. How do you respond to that? I mean, has the relevance of the carrier been reduced and therefore allow you to take greater risk there?
My sense is they have, and I'm a big believer, and this is my phrase, not any military professional, but I'm a big believer in flexible force, not fixed force. You want force that you can move around the world to meet the challenge of today and tomorrow, and if it's in the Atlantic today, it'll be in the Pacific tomorrow. We don't have a better manifestation of American power that is flexible than a carrier. With the development of unmanned aerial platforms and the Navy's work now to make sure that our carriers work with those aerial platforms too. I mean, we really can project power in interesting and different ways and flex it around the globe. I think there is more of a sort of a psychological benefit to be gained, and I think our allies and our opponents look at this. A move from 11 carriers to 10 probably sends more of a signal than a move from 330 ships total to 298. I mean, the 11 carrier and scaling it back, I think would send a psychological message of retrenchment that we just don't want to send right now, given the challenges we face in so many theaters.
There are analysts who suggest that going from a carrier build cycle of 1 every 5 years to 1 every 6 years would make the annual cost cheaper, even though the overall cost of ships cheaper. Shipyard Newport News is the largest private employer in your state. Have you considered, I mean, is that potentially a good idea?
I haven't run the math on it and looked at it. We can't dismiss anything out of the hand. Again, I just think this 11 carrier thing is really important. And you also have to remember that the build cycle is not just something you put on paper. You've got a shipyard with 20,000 employees, and they pretty much, schedule these, both the construction but also the refuels in, almost day to day. You have one in for 4 years and it's out, and then another one comes in. If you leave big gaps and vacancies in that calendar, and stretching will do that, then you put an industrial base at risk. But again, you can't dismiss anything out of hand. We are going to be looking for efficiencies and savings, but there's a statutory requirement for 11 carriers for a reason.
Coming up, more from Senator Tim Kaine on military retirement and benefits reforms. You're watching Defense News. We're continuing our conversation with Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine. I asked him if he agrees with Pentagon leaders that pay and benefits reform is a priority and whether he supports their recent proposals.
You can't tackle the fiscal challenges we have, that $17 trillion national debt, without looking at everything, and you got to look at pay and benefits. And the military folks in Virginia that I've talked to, and we are a very military state, they're not averse to it. They just want it done in a kind of a rational way. So we have a committee impaneled as a result of the NDA that was done by Armed Services before I got to the Senate, with a report dated February 15, looking at all of these pay and benefit issues and making a kind of a comprehensive set of recommendations. Many of us believe that before we start to pick one or two and tweak them, we ought to look at the comprehensive set, because that'll probably have some wisdom. You have enlisted men around the table and officers, and you've got men and women who've been veterans. You've got the whole crew. Let's get the comprehensive recommendation back and then decide what to do. That was one of the reasons why we retracted that budgetary item about military COLA, because it was like picking one thing out before we got the report, and it just wasn't, it was premature. So I think we'll get that report, and then we'll look at all of these things.
What about the commissary thing? I mean, there's a $1 billion cut in commissaries. The logic is, hey, look, commissaries were founded at a time when military bases were more isolated. Now you have a lot of other options on the table. Do you support that proposal?
It is, again, that is going to be one of the subjects that the panel is going to look at, because it's salary and retirement and health, but also non-salary benefits like commissary housing allowance. And there's probably a balanced approach to dealing with these things. Whether that commissary proposal as is emerges out of the panel, let's wait and see what the panel reports, and then we'll take action.
On more strategic terms, yeah. Russia and China in particular. Russia has seized Crimea without firing a shot, raising regional tensions. China has its latest double-digit budget increase. It's using military and economic coercion against its neighbors to try to seize territory that it claims as its own. And it's against this backdrop that the United States is sort of cutting spending. Are our actions potentially empowering some of these potential adversaries?
I think our decision to go forward with sequester, I voted to turn it off right when I got into the Senate, is foolish from a national defense standpoint. I don't know you can trace a causal relationship between the sequester and Russia and Crimea. South Georgia, when President Bush was in place in 2008, and it's, whether it's Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan, Georgia, or the Crimea, they kind of have a pattern. And I mentioned the Soviet Union, Putin was a KGB guy, so the pattern hasn't really changed. But it's interesting. I think what Russia has done is weakened their hand. Their action in Crimea has galvanized tremendous energy in the Ukraine to now really turn and go toward Europe. And if you look at Russia's west flank, pretty much all of the nations on the west flank that used to be in the orbit with the Soviet Union are now aggressively pro-Europe and really recoiling from what they see is going on in Russia. I think Russia has kind of a Rust Belt economy in terms of its demographics, in terms of being too limited in the industries it relies on. We need
natural resources, natural gas.
Yeah, and natural resource-based economies. If you have an oligarchy at the top, it's a horrible economic model because they just skim off all the money for themselves, and it doesn't create a broader-based economy. I think we're going to be able to impose. We yesterday in the Foreign Relations Committee put out a bill on sanctions against Russia because of its actions in the Ukraine. Some immediate punishment and consequences, but then an escalating series of consequences should they do more. They're going to regret this. It's going to hurt their hand internationally.
The administration has been averse to using force, citing the war weariness on the part of the American public. But America has a tremendous number of levers that it can pull to influence, and there is concern that the administration isn't using some of those tools. Why not impose almost Banco Delta? We got North Korea's attention by imposing sanctions on Banco Delta Asia, making it radioactive, bringing them back to the negotiating table. Aren't there things like that we can do with Russia that potentially make anybody who's touching Gazprom or Lukoil money so radioactive that you instantly start to get a response from Moscow?
The answer is yes, and you put your finger on the right set of levers. I think this isn't a circumstance where U.S. engagement would be that helpful or accomplish the end we want. Our lever with Russia is economic. The sanctions package that I hope the full Congress will embrace soon gets into these economic sanctions and starts to impose sanctions as a way of deterring this behavior and moving it backward. But there's more we can do, and I don't think we'll hesitate to do them. And the main thing we need to do right now is economically support the Ukrainian desire for independence by helping that country succeed. And that's why, IMF loans and things like that are so critical, immediately.
There is a criticism that, there are no whole-of-government approaches or not enough whole-of-government approaches to China and to some of these other problems. What is it that you guys in the Senate and in Congress in general can do to sort of push a more holistic view of national security?
We need to, and I'm not going to give the administration the success or credit for one success in a sec, but we've got to push engagement across all these spectra. Sometimes nations say the U.S. is disengaging if we are not as willing to engage in unilateral military action. Take the Middle East, for example. We are more diplomatically engaged across a number of key thorny issues. Economic trade and foreign direct investment is up. We're participating heavily in multilateral military activities, and we have to do it all in Afghanistan, right? In Afghanistan right now, since the Taliban fell, the life expectancy in Afghanistan has gone from age 45 to age 62. So 17-year increase in life expectancy for 30 million people. That's more than 500 million extra years of human life. That didn't happen just because of the military. The military was engaged in providing stability, but that was public health investments that lowered infant mortality, that raised life expectancy. So that's a good result and a good outcome, and that's why the overwhelming majority of the Afghan people want us to stay into a bilateral security agreement with the new government. But we were able to demonstrate the power of our involvement to them through these public health investments that have increased life expectancy. I could give you the stats on education. It'd be the same thing. Right. You only are successful if you try to balance your military strength with these other strengths: economic, diplomatic, cultural, trade. You've got to put them into a package.
But it also is, you have to have the underlying willingness to use force as well, where it's said that the administration is not as strong. Do they need to be somewhat more muscular in some of these things to pull and to exercise these levers of power?
Here's the challenge. I think we do always need to keep that on the table. And I voted for use of military force in Syria, for example, as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee back in August. But Congress wasn't going to approve it. Why did the president come to Congress at all? Because when the president didn't come to Congress in Libya, the House censured the president. The House censured the president for not coming to Congress. So the president comes to Congress, and Congress, who will talk a good game when they don't have to cast a vote. That was going to be a tough vote in the Senate, and it was going to fail in the House. What we have to do in Congress is we have to square our words with our actions. If we want a nation that's willing to use military force, then Congress has to be willing not to just talk tough, but to do it. We can't censure the president for not coming to Congress, but then expect him to make all those decisions without us. Congress has got to be willing to stand up and be counted on these issues.
And briefly, there are those who say that the Republicans stand a very good chance of winning. I was talking to a very good Republican friend of mine who said, well, he said, you know, if we do, then the situation is going to change, and if you thought that the last couple of years have been tough, they are going to be a lot tougher in the years to come. If the Republicans do win, what are the implications for defense in particular?
I think you're going to see dramatically more budget cuts. So you're going to probably see sequester on steroids in terms of a reduction of spending. And while it's not all about money, you need the right level of investment to keep America safe. I think we're perilously close to hurting ourselves by some of the foolish budget decisions we've made, and I'd worried that we would embrace austerity rather